Iwai May Apply by Evethewraith, read by Distracted by Books. This is an alternate ending to Chapter 120 of Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones, in which Iwai adopts Ivy. Chapter 1. How to Acquire a Vigilante Kid. The alleyway was dark. There wasn't a single functioning streetlight for miles around, even though this dank alleyway was near perfect replica of the dozen adjacent alleys. Iwai knew this route well. The night was one of almost perfect void. Even in the complete shroud of darkness that Uptown was constantly encased in, no star could be seen even faintly in the inky sky. The streetlights flickered on and off randomly. Even if the night lacked a trace of luster, the company that often walked with Iwai made for a light atmosphere. Most of Iwai's girls had already returned home or were elsewhere, so Iwai was the lone escortee of today. Her chaperones being Uptown's local vigilante Ivy and their pet hero Eraserhead. They not only protected her during her late-night walks home, but also made for good company. Today there was little conversation. They walked in a comfortable silence, so the only audible sounds were the silent breathing and the soft clicking of shoes. They turned the corner, exiting the tail end of the alleyway. Instead of another back street, the cracked path opened into a small car park behind a local corner shop. However, Iwai doubts the lot had ever been used, as not once in her many years has she seen a car actually parked. The multitude of ripped and full bin bags was another testament to that. Broken glass spilled over the cobbled concrete, and Iwai was acutely reminded to watch her step. The only thing worse than tripping over your heels is tripping over your heels into a nice carpet of green glass shards some drunkard had smashed carelessly onto the floor. She scraped her fingernails over the wall idly as she was walking remarkably close to the wall. The wall itself was nothing special, crumbling brick, which looked as though the surface was once a proud holder of the choppy white paint job most buildings around this specific block tended to share. Needless to say, the walls were stained gray and brown, and all those gross colors that make you wonder what the poor wall had been through. Iwai wasn't feeling particularly empathetic to this wall's story today, so she quickly retracted her hand from the wall at a glance of its filth. She made a point of walking away from the wall and around to Eraser's side. She was the farthest out of the group, the most exposed. She carefully checked the underside of her nails as if the wall had given her some disease lost to science. She was relieved to see there wasn't any dirt under them. Her attention was quickly snapped back to the abandoned area of the lot when a distant figure started shouting. His voice sounded echoey and gritty, like a smoker. Her heart dropped to her stomach when she realized she recognized the man's voice. "Iwai, you whore!" her recent ex, Haruto, shouted. He was the worst possible mix of pissed, drunk, and vengeful right now, and she knew it. It was the same tone he had when she left him, a voice promising that she'd be sorry. She froze. "You think you could just drop me like that? I told you you'd regret it," he continued, his slurred voice taunting in tone. He took a gaudy step forward, confident in that intoxicated way. He broke out into a confident stumble towards their entourage. She saw a bulge in his denim pocket, distinctly pistol-shaped. Her tongue felt like lead. She was afraid. She couldn't even mutter a warning. Eraser pushed her behind him. Iwai was grateful for a whole 2 seconds until she realized the target that was placed on the hero. Then the sounds of his footsteps stopped. He yelled again, this time louder. "Who the hell is he? You can't go a day without getting someone else's willy wet." She felt indignant, afraid, and embarrassed. Yet she couldn't do anything. Her breaths were labored and shaky. Based on how Eraser's shoulders tensed, Haruto had pulled his gun. Iwai stuck her head out from behind Eraser. To her terror, he was out of range for the hero. Ivy was in no better predicament, only one step ahead of Eraser and equally as out of range. 1,000 possibilities flashed through Iwai's head. There was then a loud sound of a gun being shot. He had missed and hit the fence a few meters behind them. She buried her head into Eraser's shoulder until she heard a weighted thump. She looked up. In an instant, Ivy had vanished. Their attacker was knocked out on the ground. Ivy stood above them. Her eyes widened. She was impressed. Then she was worried. Something had happened. The fear that racked their small body was crushing. Taking down a criminal wouldn't have this effect on Ivy. Not for their identity, but for them themselves. They were shaking like a leaf. She breathed inwards, wetly, as they turned around. The fear in their eyes made even her feel helpless. The world seemed to stop for a second. Eraser opened his mouth, and out came a name. She was hardly listening. Midoriya. Her mind echoed traitorously. Iwai wanted to forget the name as soon as it penetrated the still air. People get killed for knowing things they shouldn't. The name Midoriya painted an invisible target on her back. Eraser knew Ivy's name. Iwai didn't know if this was a good thing. Ivy may have told the hero, and this was an exclamation of relief that Ivy was okay, maybe surprised that he took the criminal down so fast. Or this may have been the moment Ivy's identity was compromised. Iwai needed more information. Even though she had an idea of what occurred, she still had to ask, "What's going on? Is he dead? What happened?" The questions came tumbling from her mouth. What happened? That was the big question. She barely heard the obvious automated answers of Eraser. They didn't truly answer her questions. She wasn't listening to Eraser's grim instructions, but more watching how Ivy was reacting. Iwai was no empath, but she could tell from the fear in Ivy's eyes that this would have consequences, whatever this was. Eventually, Eraser sent Ivy over with her. She trusted Ivy because they were her city's protector. She trusted Eraser because Ivy trusted him. Right now, Ivy seemed more scared than trusting. And the gods knew why. Their identity, their career, and potential freedom were at risk if her assumption had ground. They looked like they were ready to bolt. As they approached her, she tactfully hid them both behind a dumpster. She turned to Ivy, a serious expression on her face. She found it in herself to shake off the excess fear and spoke with conviction. "Short stack, what the hell's going on?" She tried to speak gently. Her concern only grew when the kid didn't answer. "Ivy, kid," she tried again. She didn't want to have to do this, but when she didn't hear a response, she shook their shoulders. Iwai felt relief grow when their heads slowly turned her way. "You're freaking me out, kid. What's going on? I missed something. What'd I miss? Are you hurt? I don't understand," she pleaded. She didn't know what happened. She wanted to know Ivy was all right. She was going to skin Eraser if she was right. "It's fine. Everything's fine," Ivy stuttered out, quiet and unsure. Iwai teased her lip between her teeth in worry. That didn't sound convincing at all. "Clearly everything's not fine. Why are you still scared?" She began, wanting solid confirmation. Iwai knew the kid was in no shape whatsoever to say anything more concrete than Jello. She wanted to hear him deny what she was thinking. He's knocked out. You got him, right? Is there someone else? I don't..." She trailed off as she looked around for a threat, and her eyes landed on Eraser, not for the first time. Eraser was currently glaring daggers at them both. Ivy was afraid of Eraser. That much was obvious. The big question is if she could get the kid to admit it. Her eyes snapped back to Ivy. Kid, is it him? Eraserhead? Is he up to something? Is he hurting you? I can get you out of town. Just say the word. She rambled worriedly. She looked down at her heels into the glass, assessing her capabilities. She could run in these, through the glass, get them both out of there, lay low for a while. Iwai was reminded acutely of her girls, the way she could tell when something wasn't quite right, the fear. She didn't want Ivy to go with a man who scared him to death. It left a bitter taste in her mouth. Even if Iwai knew Ivy wasn't a maiden in need of protection, she wanted to help him. No, it's fine. He won't hurt me. I can get myself out of town if I need to. Everything's fine. Ivy supplied unhelpfully. Iwai narrowed her eyes at him. Cut the crap, kid. You're scared, and there's nothing else here to be afraid of except the guy glaring daggers at us, she reasoned. She sighed, realizing she wasn't getting anywhere with this. If she wanted them to leave with her, she'd have to spell it out differently. We're leaving, she stated. The sirens began to wail in the distance. Kid, we can book it when the cops come. No, he replied too fast. No, he amended, but Ivy wouldn't take no for an answer. She shook her head distastefully. She reached out and grabbed his arm firmly. She looked into his eyes earnestly. Kid, the hell you mean no? We got to get out of here, she retorted. It came out a little too harsh, but the adrenaline made it hard to notice. He'll catch us if we try, but that doesn't matter because he's not Iwai cut them off before they could finish. The sirens were louder now and closer. If the only reason you haven't fled yet is 'cause Racer's going to catch you, then I should be more concerned, she sighed, almost ready to give up. Iwai doesn't give Ivy time to rebuttal with another shaky reassurance. Look, kid, how about you lay low for a few days? Maybe even a week. It's clear you and Racer need some time to cool down, she compromised. She just needed to get Ivy out of the situation. They were shaking more than a leaf in a hurricane, and Eraser's glare could currently burn a hole through metal. Ivy sighed. I need to face this, they said, their voice strained. Iwai didn't let them finish talking before she began to speak again. Maybe eventually, but not right now. This can wait till you and Eraser have calmed down, she reasoned, walking away with a firm grip on Ivy's arm. He reluctantly followed, apparently deciding to yield. It'll just be for a day or so, she promised, leading him into the alleyway they had crept into. Fine. Ivy finally spoke. Iwai let go of his arm and walked with Ivy in a direction that deviated from their usual walk. The hideous alleys were identical to the untrained eye, but Ivy quickly realized they didn't know where they were going. But Ivy quickly realized they didn't know where they were going. After a few minutes, it was clear they weren't going to Iwai's house. Where are we going? Ivy asked shakily. Iwai looked at him, turning another corner. If we both disappear, the first place Eraser will check is my house. We'll be going to one of my girls' place for the night, she answered quietly. I wouldn't want to bother her, Ivy stuttered, but was cut off. She's not in right now, staying with a boyfriend. She won't mind, she reassured quickly. Then, just to be sure, she added, I can message her if it makes you feel better. Ivy didn't look so sure, but he nodded nonetheless. Iwai could count that as a win. They'd disappear just for a few days while the situation was given more thought, more tact. She pulled out her phone. The light illuminated the alleyway. She typed out a quick text to their unknowing host. As the freshly traumatized duo walked into the night, not a sound could be heard in the abandoned area. Chapter 2. Accommodations. Ivy didn't quite know what they were expecting when Iwai grabbed his sleeve and carted him away from the crime scene. They walked for a little under a half hour. When the faint sounds of Iwai's steps ceased, they looked up to a decrepit building. It was a homogeneous terrace house. Judging from the numbers on the mailbox, the house turned flat was revealed to have no more than 5 occupants. The front window was boarded up from a smash. The paint was chipping off of the walls, the door, and the copper-red bricks. That was about all he could make out in the dark of 2 a.m. Instead of knocking or using a key, Iwai simply punched the door just above the lock. It knocked open. Ivy's jaw dropped. Without prompting, Iwai explained, "Shit locks." Without another word, she entered the passageway. With no other options, Ivy followed her inside. They closed the outside door behind him. Ivy went to take their shoes off, but Iwai stopped them with a hand on their shoulder. "Kid, I wouldn't do that if I were you." Ivy didn't need to ask any more questions. He followed Iwai further into the house. Once they were out of the passage, they were greeted by a door on either side of them. One was locked shut with a code. The other was open, but the lights were off, so he couldn't see whatever lay in there. Directly in front of them was the staircase. Iwai started up the stairs, and Ivy followed a respectable amount of steps behind her. Eventually, they got to the room that Iwai's girl was renting. As they laid out some blankets on the floor for Ivy, they had insisted Iwai take the bed. They ignored their instincts to run back to Eraser. While things would probably be sorted faster with Eraser, and damn, Izuku could have handled that situation so much better, he feels safer here for now. Getting some time to clear his head was definitely the correct move. He's realized that Eraser probably won't hate him. Izuku has also realized nothing would be the same between them ever. Regardless of Eraser's opinions of him, if he went, he would have panicked, and he'd be so out of it that he wouldn't even realize if he would be carted off to a foster home. It'd be so fast and on his record, and he wouldn't be able to leave. Or, God forbid, Eraser decided to let him stay with him. He'd be forever a burden. He didn't want to be under his roof, under his care, freeloading off his income and invading upon his life. Yet a small feeling niggled at the back of his mind. He shouldn't be here. He quelled it with an unsure just for a few days. His mind did not rest on its insistence. He curled up in his makeshift bed and buried his face into his pillow. Iwai had disappeared off downstairs, probably to get ready for bed. Izuku decided he could not be seen at school tomorrow. He'd have to take a few days off, if not the entire week. Understandably so. After all, it'd be a little awkward to be in class after that shit show. It'd probably start with shouting and end with a certain vigilante in handcuffs. The bedroom they were residing in was small. The place reeked of damp, and there were drained bottles of beer knocked sideways on the rotted bedside desk. It was lit only by a dim lamp, as the light switch was missing from the wall. He had switched his vigilante mask for a medical mask that Iwai had found in the bathroom drawer. He didn't want to show Iwai who he was, and Iwai didn't want to know. Some secrets are best kept, and both of them knew that motto well. It was late, and he was growing tired of the worries that plagued him. He covered himself with the sheetless duvet and tried as hard as he could to sleep. The exhaustion must have caught up to him, because as soon as his head hit the pillow, he was out for the count. He woke from dreams of dark green and static noise, feeling a hair's width away from death. He stared at the damp ceiling for a whole 20 minutes. His eyes trailed on the parts of the wall where the wallpaper peeled, trying to distract him from the dread that draped over him heavily. The curtains were shut, and the lights were off, yet streams of daylight seeped into the room regardless. Eventually, he sat up, his bones creaking in that familiar way of when he'd sleep on concrete. Wiping the crust from his eyes, he went through his pockets. Eventually, he found his Ivy phone. He opened it to find the time to be 2:45 in the afternoon. He groaned, realizing he had slept nearly 12 hours. Iwai wasn't in the room, possibly elsewhere within the building. He got out of his blankets and checked his messages. Surely enough, the phone was glitching out over the amount of messages Eraser had spammed him with. He closed his phone, unable to stomach reading through any of them. Carefully putting the phone in one of his thigh pockets, he stood. He made himself go over to the window and opened the curtains. Now, Izuku had lived in a lot of disgusting places, but this was, well, foul. The window was half covered in the wet black substance that it still was swamped in. It smelt like stale water. To make matters worse, there were smashed cups and plates balanced precariously in the sludge. The smell invaded the room instantly like a nauseous gas. Izuku shut the curtains again, his face scrunched up. He sat on the bed Iwai had slept on last night. He further considered how he could save face or come clean to Eraser. Nothing came to mind. After a few minutes, Iwai walked in again with a grim face. She looked at him as if to say, "Finally awake?" "Ivy, we better not trust the food here. We're going out for lunch." She didn't phrase it as a question. Ivy stood. "I don't have any money," they protested, knowing Iwai didn't either. Iwai just laughed. "Kid, let me teach you a thing or two. I never have any cash." She winks and leaves. Ivy just followed, knowing she wouldn't take no. The walk there was surprisingly peaceful and uneventful. They didn't recognize these parts of Uptown during daylight, and they were too disoriented last night to know where they were going. When they turned a few corners, they recognized the area enough for the worry to lessen. They were still on guard, but less so on their home turf, daylight or no. Ivy's makeup hadn't faded much around the eyes throughout the night, and their hair was tied back into a tight bun. Their hair color was almost black in the shadows of the alleys anyway. No need to worry. They had ditched their hoodie, since it was too reminiscent of Ivy, and instead simply wore his black undershirt. A medical mask donned, people gave him wide berth for fear of catching some sort of flu. When you're unable to afford medical care, being sick is like a death sentence. They made their way into a shoddy bar. The food hygiene rating on the door said 3. Ivy had eaten worse, so they didn't mind much when Iwai wordlessly led them inside. They sat near the bar, Iwai making eyes at the young-looking drinks mixer. Ivy couldn't focus, thoughts of last night swirling in his mind. The room blurred, and their thoughts turned to static. They must have zoned out from thinking too hard, because the next minute Iwai was tapping their shoulder and sitting back down beside them. They must have been really out of it, because Ivy hadn't even realized Iwai's absence. Her face looked a little worried, but she shook it off quickly. "Short stack, I've sorted a booth and food," she said quietly, gesturing to a table under a broken light. Ivy was quite glad for this, as his green hair was visible under the yellow lights of the bar. It was probably a coincidence, a table they were more inclined to lend for cheap. Ivy stood up and walked towards where Iwai had pointed. His footsteps were swift and unsure. She followed closely. They sat on the side of the booth facing the door, while Iwai sat opposite them. Already at the table were 2 dishes of what seemed to be miso in some children's portions and a small side of rice. 2 half-filled glasses of water accompanied the dishes. The food seemed cold, but it was a generous meal, especially since they had paid nothing. Iwai had a sip of her water. Ivy sat to the side, with their mask half done up to obscure Iwai's vision. They both ate in comfortable silence. Iwai put down her glass. Sensing that she wanted to speak, they finished their mouthful. They put their mask back on, turning to face her. How long till you want to go back? Do you even want to go back, Shortstack? She began, her voice low so nobody except them could hear. This inquiry gave Ivy pause. They had to go back eventually, but the thought of seeing Eraser right now left a sinking feeling in their stomach. Izuku's absence from school just burned any shred of doubt lingering that Ivy was Midoriya. They had really stabbed themselves in the foot with their on-the-spot breakdown. He could have denied the accusations. One for all meant he couldn't skip town. He couldn't be a rogue vigilante with a power he could barely control. All Might needed more than that. But the idea of going with Eraser made him feel like an iceberg was nearing his voyage. The end. The end of everything he had worked towards. The end of a friendship. The question Iwai had asked made him want to curl up and drown in his subpar, cold, stale miso. He felt as useless as ever, like a puppet whose master had given up on a roadside show. The gig's up, and now he's left alone in the ashes of a dream. I don't know. Not now. He wanted to add not ever, but he knew that he couldn't just abandon All Might and his only shot at a pipe dream. He stuttered, but at this point he couldn't care enough. Iwai met Izuku's eyes. Do you want to go, or are you afraid of what he will think? Izuku knew that he was referring to Eraser in this context, but he automatically recontextualized it to All Might. He mulled it over in his mind like he was kneading a large sheet of overfloured dough. He came to the quick conclusion that he'd be absolutely crushed if All Might hated him, and he'd be in no position to continue progressing with One for All without outside support. Iwai, I need to... He sighed. I can't control my quirk well. I need support to help. If not, it just do more harm than good, he explained, hoping, pleading she wouldn't press. She didn't. The conversation was over, so Izuku pulled his mask to the side again. They continued eating in silence. Despite the tension in his shoulders, the atmosphere was almost comfortable. He could tell Iwai wanted to press more, but she knew this wasn't the place to discuss such matters. Their portions were small, but they ate slowly to fill the time. They forgot about their lack of mask for a split second and turned to face Iwai. She looked up and had to do a double take. For the first time, she didn't see Ivy. She saw Izuku. Chapter 3. Meow. She gazed upon his youthful face and her eyes widened. Huh? You're a kid, she said loudly. Luckily, nobody noticed her outburst, so more quietly she added, You're like, what, 12? Izuku's face morphed into that of horror. His small lapse in sensible thought had just ruined everything. This week was screw-up after screw-up. He couldn't keep being so stupid. This kind of thinking would have gotten him killed a few years ago. He was bound to fail eventually. How far could a quirkless null go? Really. But he wasn't a quirkless anymore. He had the power of All Might. Was he so useless that not even All Might could fix him? In the same moment, shock flitted over Iwai's face for the second time. Recognition gleamed across her hazel eyes. Izuku's heart almost stopped right then. She knew who he was. She knew. She knew. The room faded away into static, his ears ringing like abused wind chimes. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't do this. He couldn't. A hand on his shoulder shocked him, reaching for him, and he violently batted it away, fear and paranoia clogging his senses. The room was too hot, and everything and everyone was too close. He needed to get away. He stood but fell back stupidly upon realizing he had nowhere to go. Maybe he could go back to the brewery, but what would be the point? His identity was compromised. His future was compromised. The only thing waiting for him would be an empty office and eventually a horde of police officers. They'd find him eventually. It was only a matter of time. He couldn't bear to pack his life in a box ever again. Not now. Not ever. Eraser would be disappointed if he pushed everyone away. He'd think Izuku was a coward for running, especially from Iwai. She had no business hurting Izuku. The room came back into his focus slowly as he focused on keeping his breathing steady. He looked to Iwai, but he couldn't meet her eyes. He just barely caught her saying, "You're that kid from the sports fest?" Her tone was hushed, yet he could still hear her shock and disbelief underlying her tone. Time slowed down once more as he waited for her to calm down. Something clicked in her mind as Ivy finally looked up. She recognized the kid. Well, obviously he was Ivy, but she recognized the person behind the mask. The kid from the sports festival. You, Midoriya Izuku? You won the sports fest, she repeated just for the sake of it. She remembered how yesterday she had heard the name Midoriya. She didn't recognize it at the time, but now, seeing the face that plagued headlines for a week or so, she couldn't deny the truth. Ivy, badass, stealthy vigilante, was the boy who blew up the stadium. That amount of firepower coming from Ivy? Never in a million would a single person ever connect it. It was too uncanny, improbable. Yet when she thought back to how expertly he faced Endeavor's kid during the Quirkless rematch, it suddenly made sense. She realized she had left Ivy hanging as he awaited her reaction. She didn't have to play it up. It'd only panic him. It had been a long week, and she didn't want to be the reason it was longer. Let's talk about this not here. She grabbed her purse. Despite her efforts to hide it, it was obvious she was shaken. There were too many people, and it seems Ivy hadn't even noticed. She stood abruptly. Ivy's eyes hadn't strayed from their previous position. Ivy, we're going? She coaxed. He looked up slowly in response. Come on, she repeated. He rose from his seat and he awkwardly turned, unwedging himself from the space between the leather booth seats and the sticky table. He followed Iwai gormlessly to the exit, weaving around tables. When they got outside, it was still light outside, despite it being summer. The breeze chilled them and the skies were gray. As they made their journey back to the flat, Iwai found that Ivy was walking slightly behind her. This normally would have been strange, but recently the words Ivy and normal went together like a sandwich in a bubble bath. just yesterday he was her escort on the way home. Now it was like she was a candle in the void with how he trailed closely behind, unsure and not fully there, like a dazed moth. She was glad, however, that he hadn't straight up bolted. She was reminded of her girls, how they'd find safety in numbers and stick close. Finding Ivy to be so young was shocking, and it made her doubt herself. Maybe she wasn't as perceptive as she thought. How could she miss this for years? She knew he was young, and he was short. Maybe it was the suit. Made him look older? But that wasn't an excuse. You can stick anyone in a suit, but not everyone can fight crime like Ivy. Iwai didn't doubt Ivy's abilities. Even now that he was revealed to be a 14, maybe 15-year-old Izuku Midoriya, she felt the need to protect him, but it was redundant now. Too late. She looked back at Ivy, unsure if she should say anything. Iwai wasn't unsure often, but this situation was unlike anything she has had to handle to date. They walked in total silence. It wasn't awkward per se, but it was certainly not comfortable. Eventually, they turned a corner into a more open alley. A large sign of a shop came into view. 2 floors tall and painted a graying tan. The top floor was probably the house of the shopkeep, with trinkets peeking out from the murky glass and dark curtains. With the clouds dusking, Iwai knew that she wouldn't have a chance to buy actual food at least until tomorrow. She turned towards Ivy, who had stopped walking when Iwai had hesitated. His dull gaze paused on her. "We need to stop for a minute," she said quietly, though her voice echoed off these empty streets. Ivy nodded absent-mindedly. Izuku was tired. Like the dip in adrenaline after you get off that one roller coaster you've been hyping yourself up for all afternoon, only to find it to be slow, kind of tired. They walked into the shop, its yellowish lights flickering. The air smelt stale, and there were no staff behind the counter. Iwai scooped up one of the rusted baskets beside the door. Izuku followed Iwai around like a lost puppy as they went aisle by aisle. He was so out of it that his gaze followed the scuffed tiles more than where Iwai was leading them. When Iwai's basket had a few things in it, she led them both to the empty counter. Lifting a hand to ring the bell, she put her basket on the counter. Izuku's eyes flitted over the items. A few packets of ramen, a large packet of rice, tampons, and a large bottle of water. A hatch in the ceiling opened, and there was a pause before a ladder slid down from the ceiling. It hit a particularly weathered area of the floor, where the tile was missing, showing browned concrete beneath. A petite woman came down the ladder. Her hair was dyed a yellowish blonde with red roots peeking out. She was tanned with a pink shirt and leather jacket. "Oh, Iwai!" she smiled, turning to face them. Iwai smiled. "Hi, Mika. Just here for a quick run." "You got a friend?" Mika asked, gesturing to Izuku as she scanned Iwai's items. "Right, here's Ivy." Iwai responded, fishing her purse out of her pocket. It felt strange to be referred to as Ivy right now, when he was anything but. He felt so tired and vulnerable, not like a vigilante. He didn't deserve to be called Ivy when all he was Izuku. He kept his mouth shut, though. Even if he wanted to speak, he didn't think he could. He rubbed his eye, realizing he probably looked a mess when black rubbed off onto his hand. "Ivy!" She leaned in, whispering, though nobody was in the shop. "Like the vigilante?" Iwai nodded, and Mika studied Izuku thoroughly. "I won't say much. It's not my place, really," Iwai added, glancing. "I won't ask you to," the shopkeep said, giving Iwai a look. "We all know you're a gossip." Iwai went to pay for her items, but Mika held a hand up. "No need for a friend, an uptown struggling vigilante." "Don't be ridiculous," Iwai pressed. "It's not much." Izuku watched this weird back and forth tentatively. It hurt that Iwai was spending money on him. Yeah, maybe she'd use it all too, but he'd be nothing but a leech. If Iwai paid, she'd be down money for him. If Mika covered it, she'd be weighed down for them both. Ever stubborn Iwai. Mika scoffed. Half. She started bagging Iwai's items. If you so insist. Iwai put some cash on the counter. I do so insist. The 30 minutes they spent in that corner shop felt like hours. Izuku felt exhausted, like he could sleep for a week. No problem, tired. Like he'd just been on a full patrol on no sleep, tired. Iwai and her friend were chatting for ages while he was just standing there. It was getting dark out, and Izuku was following Iwai back to their flat like a reanimated corpse. In the end, they went half on price. Friend discounts did wonders, but that didn't mean Izuku was any less mortified by even the act. If Izuku wasn't here, Iwai could have gone to her home. She wouldn't have even needed to spend anything. Maybe he was thinking too hard over nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like the only thing he ever did was burden the people around him. Every time the rug was pulled out from under him, he fell on someone else. He was just pulling Iwai down. He had to leave. He couldn't bear to leech off of Iwai's kindness, but not now. She just bought stuff for them. Maybe in a day. Maybe two. Or she could return it before they even got back to the crappy flat he was forcing Iwai to stay in. This was all too much. His eyes skidded around the fire escapes, the outpoking bricks, fences he may be able to climb, any and all possible routes out of here, away from the people who didn't deserve to be burdened by him. Then his eyes glanced at the moving figure of Iwai slightly ahead of him. He should be keeping her safe. The clouds were dusking overhead, and though Uptown was safer than it was, maybe, a year ago, it was still dangerous. He could do this. He straightened his back and walked ahead to stand beside Iwai. Looking around, Izuku recognized they were in a more residential area. The windows on either side of the alleyway weren't boarded, as they would have been in more populated areas. A couple of the lights were on, and only a sparse amount of litter decorated the ruined pavement. Then there was a loud bang to the right, like glass smashed into 1,000 exclamation marks. Izuku whipped his head to the noise. The yellowish light of the darkened street lamps flickered on, bathing the alleyway in stark shades of yellow. Though faded and slight, it reminded them vaguely of neon nuclear symbols. Danger. They looked towards Iwai, who had paused. Then their heads snapped to the window. A shock wave forced its way through the glass, the pane shattering and shards raining down like iced knives. Pure energy knocked a singular can of beer into the wall before the force reached Ivy and Iwai. Chapter 4. What if instead of dialogue, I just... Ivy tried to shield Iwai. They really did. Leaping from where they were standing, they pushed her to the ground, the contents of her bag spilling out dramatically over the pavement, and he hissed when sharp glass bullets rained, carried by the sudden wave. Ivy didn't have time to apologize to her before they heard muffled bangs and sobs from within the house. They stood quickly, hastily putting one leg through the window frame, looking back to Iwai. Glancing at her crouched figure while she stood warily, their eyes met. They looked away quickly and passed the rest of their body through into the house, and he turned away to enter the building. Iwai would understand. Clothes getting caught on the remaining shards stuck stubbornly in the window, he persisted through. A pocket on their cargo pants was snatched by the jagged remnants of glass. Luckily, instead of tearing, their force ripped the entire fragment out of the frame, taking it with him in his forceful haste. Paying no mind, they pushed into the scene. The flat was messy, not in a not taken care of way, more as a lived in, maybe with a kid kind of way. Hero figures knocked off of shelves, a few toys scattered around, paint stains on a dinner table. They paused in the living area for a second. They had no idea where to go from here and had practically ditched Iwai. They weren't even in full Ivy get-up. No mask, and their hoodie was still at their place. This was fine. What wasn't fine was their knives missing from their pockets. They were just out for lunch, not expecting to have to be a vigilante today. They had left their weapons on their bed. Could you blame them? They were barely ready to be a person at all. They heard another dull bang. Following the sudden noise, they found themselves in a bedroom. There was a large figure standing over a crumpled person. Bang! 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 The wall shook hard, punctuated by the wails of a young child clawing at the assailant's legs. Ivy crept closer. The smell of blood infested the still air like a burning candle of agony. A small toddler stood by the legs of the violent woman, tears running down his face. Her hand was illuminated by the slight evening light creeping from behind the shut blinds. Her fist held the hair of the other woman as she abused her over and over, paying no mind to anything but the motion and each sharp thump of head meeting wall echoing grotesquely around the room. Ivy needed to think this over carefully. If they just rushed in, they could also harm the crumpled woman along with the child. They had to get her attention, distract her. Blood rushing in their ears, they frantically patted their pockets for anything. Empty, empty, bang, empty his discarded mask. Bang! His wrist caught on the jagged glass embedded in his pocket. Sharp stinging, muffled by his adrenaline, tingled in his finger, and he wrapped his shaking fist tightly around the pain. It probably wasn't a serious injury, though he couldn't really see. He threw the shard at the wall. It harmlessly bounced off, yet shattered as it clinked against the laminate floors. The previously transfixed woman whipped her head around like a spell was broken, dropping her unconscious, hopefully not dead, victim as her eyes met Ivy's. The child abandoned his attack and rushed to his mother's side, blood pooling dangerously. The woman took a step forward. Ivy charged, tackling the assaulter. She fell sideways with a dull clanking noise. Ivy kicked her in the head. She screamed and aimed a powerful shockwave at them. Unprotected, Ivy flew into the wall before they could even react. Pain flooded their body and their vision went blurry. A ringing filled their ears and it felt like they couldn't breathe. With shaking legs, they peeled themselves off of the wall, lunging for her. They didn't realize they had activated One for All before the room was basked in a jarring jade glow. His vision blacked out like a vignette. In the corner of his darkened vision, he caught a glimpse of Iwai in the doorway. She was watching, slight concern in her eyes, but her face didn't betray her. Grabbing the assailant's arm, they threw her now standing body over their shoulder. She flew into the crater, cracking the plaster even more as chips of paint fluttered to the ground. She fell to the ground. Their wrist cried in protest, sending a boiling flurry of pain up his arm. Their fingers shook as Ivy commanded them, hesitant to ignore their pain, yet they still obeyed their will. Despite Ivy's injured weakness, she fell overhead, so it was a win. When she fainted, he was quick to put weight on her while she was down. He had nothing to tie her with. Scanning the room, his eyes found an extension lead. He quickly scooped it up and knotted it around her hand. The rubber protested and the knot undid, but he was in a rush. They stood and rushed to the victim's side. Sirens echoed, but they mattered far less than the broken woman laid with a fussing child shaking her frantically. "Kid, you need to move," Ivy spoke, trying to assess the woman's injuries quickly. An eel quirk, maybe? The boy, 8 or maybe 9, sobbed in response. Standing up straighter, I... Get away from her! You're just gonna make it worse! He held up his hands and small shock sparked between his fingers. Ivy wasn't so worried about the child's quirk than he was about his mother. We're running out of time. We're gonna lose her if you get in my way. The kid hit him, a small static shock running through his body. That was going to get annoying. He crouched into the stain. The carpet was disgustingly moist with blood. It stuck to him and seeped into his trousers. We don't have time for this, they snapped. Ivy tore a chunk of cloth off the threadbare duvet that hung from the bed. They pressed it against the major head wound, probably from when she was dropped. The hard corner of the bedside table had splatters of blood, possible skull fracture. The temple was the thinnest part of the skull, after all. Ivy applied pressure while the child shook and shocked them. It made their already agonizing wrists shake impossibly more. They couldn't apply pressure like this. More blood was just coating his hand than anything. They were half considering shoving the child away forcefully when they realized Iwai had walked in, keeping an eye on the downed woman. It was most likely safer for her to hold the kid than for him. He was trying not to kill this freaking woman. Iwai, he grunted as the kid stunned him again. His arm spasmed once more, the already injured muscles giving out. She got the hint and stalked forward. Standing behind the kid, she grabbed him, holding his palms against his chest, and using pure strength to keep the struggling boy at bay. Ivy didn't want to stay around for the ambulance, so he needed to wrap this up to the point where he could be confident this woman wouldn't bleed out. It was difficult. Her scaled skin was smooth, hard to grip. He ripped off a larger chunk of fabric from the duvet. He wrapped it once around the head, for the fabric wasn't long enough to do so twice, pulled it taut, and tied it. It wasn't the best, but it put pressure on the right place. The bleeding had slowed considerably, so it was just a matter of absorbing the remaining blood. They stood, gesturing for Iwai to drop the kid. He had probably realized Ivy wasn't going to do any damage, or maybe Iwai was digging her nails into his arm, but either way, he ignored them both to check on his mother. She's lucky to have a little kid like that, Iwai murmured. Little shit, though. She rolled up her sleeves to check for any scrapes. Distantly, there was a small noise through the silent building, like carpet shifting or something falling to the ground. Iwai, we should go. The sirens stopped. Ivy turned. We should leave before anyone else gets... He looked up at dark eyes and messy hair. Iwai was still at his side. An exasperated voice filled the room. Kid. Izuku stared. He could hear a thick trace of exhaustion and concern lining his tone. It made him feel nauseous. Eraser. Izuku started, but Iwai cut in. Eraserhead. She took a step forward. Leave, now, or I swear I'll let everyone in Uptown know that you're just Iwai, that's enough. Eraser cut in. Behind him, officers trickled through the door. I just want to talk. To say these few days had been difficult would be a massive frickin' understatement. He had searched for hours for Midoriya after he had run off. Nothing. Shota had returned home stressed and with heavy eyes. Expertly evading Hisashi's questions, he eventually got the slightest sliver of sleep. He wanted to assume that Iwai was with him, so at least he wouldn't be alone, at the very least. Then again, it seemed a very Ivy thing to run away from her the moment he had calmed down. A migraine stung at his head. He'd given Hisashi a very brief version of yesterday, and they had called them both off work for personal matters. But despite his absent from his health class, he was quick to leave for patrol once the slightest hint of evening showed across the summer sky. He made sure to grab his intercom and message Tsukachi to drop in on any phone calls in the area. Uptown's residents didn't often call in incidents because when called, they either didn't show up or came so late it didn't matter. Though if Ivy was going out on his own, he would have to call in incidents. Now he strolled uptown, stopping crime, sure, but he was really there to make sure Ivy, he had decided to call him so because he didn't want to think about Midoriya, wasn't patrolling alone. Realistically, he knew Ivy wasn't that stupid. He'd lay low for a few days, but Shota just had to confirm for his own peace of mind. He had just dropped down to the scene of a simple robbery when his comm beeped to life, Tsukashi's voice ringing out in crackling audio. Eraser? Glancing at the continuing assault, he winced. Bad timing. Give me a moment. He mumbled into the comm. He crept towards the two. The girl had stopped struggling. The teenage boy, just young enough to be one of his students, let go for a moment, grabbing his phone. Shota swiftly made his way over, his shoes silent against the cobbled concrete. A punch met the boy's face like an unstoppable force. His head reeled back, the sound snapping through the air. He took a step back, shocked, and turned toward Shota. You bitch, he barked out. Now he was far enough away from the girl it hardly mattered. He was wrapped in Shota's capture scarf within a second. Snatching some cuffs from his belt, he grabbed the boy's wrist, binding it to his broken street light overhead. Perched on the roof above the alleyway, he finally heard the whir of sirens and opened the comm once more. Any news on Ivy? He asked, antsy for any news. He felt devastated that Midoriya felt that he had to run. There's nothing he wouldn't do for the kid to be happy. No, but there was a call from a woman demanding for Eraser 10 minutes away from your location. An incident at such and such. A break-in, it seems. Police have also been called, the detective reported. He nodded into his scarf, as if Tsukashi could see on it. When Tsukashi said 10 minutes, he didn't take into account the desperation and determination behind each of Shota's movements. He was going to set the record straight and help him whether he liked it or not. It wasn't on their typical patrol route, so either Ivy was on patrol trying not to be seen, or this was an unexpected incident. He hoped it was the former, for Ivy's sake. He realized as he opened the unlocked door that this was eerily similar to the last time he had to rescue Ivy from that building. Luckily, this one wasn't on fire, and hopefully Ivy wasn't in danger. But he felt the same stress nonetheless. Distantly, silence echoed across the vacant streets, his back up. The front room was ruined, glass strewn about the floor, toys broken and knocked over. The TV was smashed and chairs had fallen to the laminate. He heard movement from another room, a thump against the carpet, a sigh, and sobbing? It was a series of ugly sobs, and for a moment Shota worried it might be Ivy. He dismissed the thought quickly, though he still found himself rushing to the next room. Ivy was standing beside Iwai, his footprints caked in blood against the matted carpet. Blood trickled freely down his hand. His costume was missing his green hoodie, and he didn't seem to be wearing a mask. Iwai, we should go. The sirens stopped. Ivy turned. We should leave before anyone else gets... Kid. He found himself saying it before the thought to be more tactful crossed his mind. With his face mask lost somewhere, black eyeshadow faded and smudged, and freckles adorning his face, it was undeniably Midoriya. Eraser. Midoriya opened his mouth as if he wanted to continue but didn't know what with. Iwai cut in, an unsure but defensive look on her face. Eraserhead? She took a step forward as if to shield Midoriya. Leave. Now, or I swear I'll let everyone in Uptown know that you're just Iwai. That's enough. Eraser interrupted. He knew she wouldn't let him anywhere near Midoriya, but he had to try. Behind him, officers trickled through the door. I just want to talk. That wasn't true, though. He wanted to leave this building with Midoriya, bring him to the apartment. But he didn't know how. There was silence for a few seconds. These past 24 hours had been the most draining, stressful, soul-sucking time of his life, and now this moment was his only chance to help his friend, his student. Everything hinged on him getting it right. Shota had never felt so useless. It's okay. We need to talk anyway. Midoriya tried to agree, but he looked into the distance through Shota like he wasn't really there. There was a glaze over his eyes. Iwai noticed the pause too, and she looked back for a moment, just a second, trying to make sure Shota didn't do anything. Ivy? Right, sorry. We do need to talk. Midoriya glanced at the police and paramedics, who had taken both victim and assailant away and were teetering on the edge of eavesdropping, seemingly trying to check on the second blood-stained child. Not here. Not here, echoed Shota. Iwai nodded and expressed that she knew a place to discuss. The three of them turned to leave and were about to exit the front door when Midoriya fell against the wall. Midoriya, what's wrong? He called out, taking a quick series of steps to the boy's side. Just a little lightheaded, he slurred, and fell unconscious against Shota's chest. Iwai called out in surprise, and a paramedic, who happened to have been glancing through the door, exclaimed for the others to follow. As the bloodied boy was loaded onto the gurney, Shota found the weight of helplessness and incompetence slipped back into its place at the forefront of his mind. He hadn't known a week ago he could feel such strong feelings of being out of his depth in worry, but now, to his horror, he found its familiar weight less infuriating than it was exhausting. Chapter 5. Uh-oh. Beeping filled Izuku's ears like an incessant drum. He wanted to bring his hands to his skull and rip his ears off, but his limbs felt as heavy as lead. He fought the drowsiness that plagued his mind, yet it seemed futile. Izuku managed to open his eyes, just for a brief moment. Bright light assaulted his eyeballs like an aimed laser, so he snapped them shut once more. Almost ready to give up and succumb to the exhaustion, he let his tensed limbs relax. Then he heard footsteps, dull and thumping heavily across the flooring. The sound making him panic. Footsteps were never good. Their noise seemed to overtake the wretched beeping, and it all but faded into the recesses of his skull. He couldn't let whoever it was get closer. Didn't he shove the cabinet in place? He strained to open his eyes, groaning and blinking shut. Midoriya? A tired voice asked, as if hopeful of something. Eraser? He definitely shouldn't be here. Izuku nearly asked himself how the hero even got in, but he realized quickly that he probably wasn't in the brewery. The beeping, the stiff bed, he was in the hospital. Hospital? He forced out, wrenching his eyes open. Any panic he felt was muffled, the adrenaline moving through his veins like a thick sludge. Right. That fight earlier. The woman and the kid. The light didn't seem so harsh against his eyes this time as he strained his muscles to stare up at Eraser. He looked solemn and angry. Thousands of small worry lines marred his exhausted face all at once. His mouth felt dry as his mind scrambled for any semblance of excuse. He couldn't think of anything that could quell the anger Eraser was surely festering against him. They stared in silence for a second, neither having anything to say. Izuku felt like he'd never be able to speak again. There was nothing about Eraser's gaze that was particularly cold, but it was abundantly clear he was pissed. Tension built in the room, and it seemed to suffocate Izuku. His face felt crusted, and the only thing that was stopping him from passing out was the stress of the situation. Finally, as if sensing Izuku's discomfort, Eraser spoke. Idiot. That was the most idiotic thing you could have done. Running off like that? Even a seasoned pro could die going out like that. Izuku stayed silent. He remembered how he was 1 second from leaving Iwai to be all alone. He was glad that Eraser would never know that particular plight of his. If he had, in fact, abandoned Iwai, he's sure Eraser's mood would dramatically plummet from pissed to livid. He tried to keep his breathing steady as Eraser spoke. He was confronting the truth, like he said he would just the other day. Sure, it was much sooner than he would prefer, but he knew it would come. He couldn't spend the rest of his life running. Izuku wasn't worthless anymore. If he died alone, covered in blood, or sick, it'd be a waste. He had one for all, and he couldn't just throw away All Might's trust and legacy. I'm pissed, but I understand why you ran. It was reckless and stupid. And if you ever do it again, you will lose your place in the hero course, Aizawa said, as if he hadn't already screwed any sliver of chance that he had to remain in the course. You mean, he dared to ask, prayed it wasn't a slip of the tongue, hoping desperately that he meant it. Yes, you can stay in the hero course, but things can't stay as they are. Izuku winced, though he was glad that didn't rule out other punishments. You have options, Midoriya. You aren't alone. Izuku wanted to press more. What were his options? Who would take a useless quirkless like him? Foster care. He knew he was no longer powerless, but he felt just as pathetic. Maybe he could become a ward of UA? It sounded flimsy at best. If nothing else, you should stay with Zashi and I while you recover. Then we can look into it more, he finished. There was a hint of something in his voice. Maybe Izuku was still sleepy, but he couldn't quite make out the strain in his voice. He didn't even want to think about it. He didn't want to press. Deciding to change the subject, he asked, recover? What exactly happened? I don't think just passing out would require all of this. Actually, I was going to ask you about that. The doctor said there were complications with eel poisoning. The man looked thrown, even as he spoke the words. Huh? Izuku just stared at Aizawa. Eel. Oh, that woman. The one bleeding out. She was adorned with some kind of smooth scales, and her kid had an electrical stunning quirk. It would make sense if she was an eel mutant. It could have been a quirk-related hate crime. Seemed like a bold assumption. Though Izuku was definitely sure that he hadn't eaten the woman. Could it transfer via blood? He did have that cut on his hand, but it was tiny and affected him way too fast. It could have been heightened by the possibility that it's a quirk effect, or maybe by his exhaustion or his numerous injuries. I guess that makes sense. He decided to voice his opinion on the matter. The victim, I think she had some sort of eel quirk. That lines up with what the suspect said, Aizawa agreed. Izuku wanted to ask what the suspect had said, but he wasn't Ivy, and he wasn't sure Aizawa would willingly tell his 15-year-old student case details just because they were involved. Then the hero spoke again after a moment of bursting silence. You should get some more rest. I'll come get you tomorrow. Visiting hours are almost up. And he left the room without another word. It would be safe to say that Izuku wouldn't be getting any more rest, though surrounded by the thin hospital blue curtains he could tell there was one or two other people inhabiting the room, not to mention nurses going in and out. It was still light out, but it was late evening, the summer sky refusing to dim in the face of night. Before long, angelic rays of sunlight streamed through the window. The curtains that Izuku had left undisturbed through the night muffled the morning glow harshly. Despite this, they still roused Izuku from the half-doze he had found himself in. It was difficult to say exactly what time it was, but it was safe to assume it was the ass-crack of dawn. It was summer, and the only thing that roused before the sun itself was the chirping birds of day. Did Izuku mention they chirped a lot? He felt like that was important to gauge his mood. The boy had been worrying all night. His brief bouts of sleep came with sudden flashes of dreams that could only be described as horrific. Aizawa would hate him. He'd take up their space, food, and money. What if someone found out about his crimes and Aizawa would get thrown under the bus for vouching for him? Would his career be ruined? What if All Might found out and hated him? If he didn't want Izuku to have One for All anymore, Izuku didn't know what he'd do with himself. Logically, he knew he was blowing this out of proportion, but even if you know a spider wouldn't kill you, you'd still keep your distance to quell your fears. Though in this case, he was trying not to crush the spider's web while forcefully being invited to sit on it. They'd crumble under his weight eventually. His crisis was hastily thrown to the back burner as the door opened. Izuku reached a hand forward to peek through the papery curtain. Instead of a nurse, or even Aizawa, who he saw was most unexpected. Tenya Ida? He blinked. Ida peered into the room and quickly realized he was in the wrong one. He turned, flushed, to check the room number. Then he caught a glimpse of Izuku. "Midoriya!" the boy said a little too loud. Great. It was clear he wanted to inquire about his bedridden position. Great. Especially since he'd been ignoring Izuku beforehand. Ida, what are you doing here? He asked, though he wanted to tell Ida to mind his business. Ida opened the curtain so he could see him better. I was trying to find my brother, but I seem to have entered the wrong room, he explained, somehow both solemn and sheepish, before standing up straighter and saying, But, Midoriya, are you okay? Izuku was happy to see Ida, even the littlest bit like his usual self, in spite of his brother's situation. Oh, it's nothing. I was training right after the sports festival and fainted, he lied. My mother hasn't come to collect me yet since she works hard hours. He looked to the side. I would wait with you, but I need to see Tensei. I understand, really. Go see him. Izuku attempted to coax him to leave, though when Ida placed his hand on the doorknob, it was pushed open without him. Ida quickly let go as Aizawa entered the room. As Aizawa walked in, he paused in the doorway. Then he glanced to the side to see Izuku. Ida, what brings you here? Aizawa asked dryly, glancing between them both. Izuku didn't like where this was going. How would he explain to Ida why their teacher was here? I was just visiting Tensei, and I opened the wrong room, he explained once again, looking embarrassed. Izuku cut in quickly to make sure Aizawa didn't contradict any of his lies. I'm waiting for my mother to come collect me. Since you're here, though, could she not make it? He pretended to look a little disappointed. Aizawa stared for a second. Right. She has something going on in Tokyo, I believe. I was also in the area because I was about to visit Ingenium too. Izuku nodded, as if let down by the information that the hero had just pulled out of his ass. He continued, Ida, if you don't mind, can Midoriya come with us to see Ingenium? He's being discharged, and I have to escort him home due to his mother's absence. Ida looked conflicted, but Midoriya was his friend, and he did need to leave this room. After a moment, he simply nodded. He seemed hesitant, however, rightfully so, as this was his brother in crippling condition, and Izuku had no right to infringe on his family's privacy. Aizawa pressed his hand against the steel pushpad, opening the door. The three of them entered Tensei's hospital room. Izuku's eyes surveyed the room, observing how it quite obviously looked similar to all others within the hospital. However, the occupant being a rich hero, it was a private room he had to himself. Apparently, his parents weren't here yet, or weren't coming. Izuku was glad for that, as he didn't think he could make nice with so many people at once. Though he did find it strange. They may have already visited. Izuku had changed in the hospital bathroom into hero merch that was a tad bit too big. He appreciated Aizawa for bringing it, but he really didn't want to be wearing a hoodie with President Mike's face in print across the front. Izuku didn't really have anything to say to the hero, so he stood to the side while Aizawa and he conversed. Ida sat silently on the bedside chair, listening but not contributing. Eventually, Tensei expressed his disappointment over not being able to have Tenya for his first internship. So, Tenya, Midoriya, any particular names you're looking at? Tensei asked, though he didn't sound particularly pressing. Izuku let the silence hang, unwilling to be the first of the two addressed to answer. I just got over 300 offers, Tenya offered, though his voice was quiet and his tone was rather clipped. I'm thinking of going with Manuel. Manuel? Why? He's a decent hero, but he hasn't really got anything to offer you. Aizawa cut in, questioning him. Tenya hesitated. He will give me insights into the standards of heroics. I feel his principles align with what I wish to become as a hero, and I wish to have him as a role model. At least have a look through your list, Tenya, Tensei reasoned. If you truly want to go with Manuel, there's no reason not to. Aizawa nodded, apparently also agreeing with this topic. Izuku could not do such, as the truth of his peer's internship choice dawned upon him. If his memory served correctly, the hero Manuel was based in Hosu, the very city in which Tensei was crippled. He couldn't dwell on these implications as the question was turned towards him. Now, he wouldn't be able to confidently say who he'd decided to pick, nor would he say so in this particular company. The thought of humoring Endeavor's offer niggled in the back of his mind. He could get that proof for Todoroki. I have thousands to sort through. I haven't landed on any sure names yet, Izuku supplied. Oh, that's a shame. If you need any help, Tensei leaned in and muttered playfully, or a little dirt. I could lend a hand. Izuku was pretty sure this was an empty offer, as they'd probably not meet again, but he appreciated it. He gave thanks regardless. I don't think any of your advice should dictate his internship, Aizawa said, almost teasing. They chatted for another few minutes before Aizawa checked his phone and announced that Hizashi was here to collect them and escort Izuku home. In the car ride to Aizawa's apartment, he found himself significantly less afraid than he would have been just a few days ago. Sure, he was on the verge of a panic attack, and he very much didn't want to be in this car, but considering he couldn't remember the walk to Iwai's friend's house, he thought he was doing just fine. Shit. Iwai. Is Iwai okay? He stuttered. He would have thought she'd break into the hospital if Aizawa kept her away. I managed to convince her to go home and get some sleep before her shift just before you woke up, the tired hero explained idly from the passenger seat. He could barely be heard over Hizashi's loud music. That's good, Izuku replied. He'd have to message her that he's okay. He didn't feel okay, but it seemed on a scale of mortal peril and slight discomfort, he was a solid 6. The drive went in otherwise silence. He dreaded the moment they pulled into the car park. He'd lived in a rundown warehouse for years. He thought he could manage being a burden until the hero either got sick of him or he was placed somewhere else. He could do this. End of story.